This is Echo Zoe Radio, episode 173 for September 2022, with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson on his book Traced.
Welcome to Echo Zoe Radio, the podcast outreach of Echo Zoe Ministries, where you'll hear about important topics affecting the church today. Our primary goal is to explore a variety of issues while remaining faithful to God and His Word. Stay with us for the next hour as your host, Andy Olson, shares his conversation with this month's guest. Here's your host, Andy Olson.
I'm Andy Olson. Thanks for listening to Echo Zoe Radio. This is episode 173 for September 2022. With all of YouTube's faults, they got something right. In early 2021, I had a video suggestion pop up on my YouTube account that was about the new history of the human race. The YouTube algorithm seems to know me pretty well. The video was part of a series that was released by Answers in Genesis, in which Ken Ham interviewed this month's guest, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. Nathaniel had been digging into the genetic history of humanity and found some really fascinating things. I started watching and found myself binge watching the entire series, which ended up being around 24 or 25 videos long at about an hour each. Dr. Jensen holds a PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University. He's been studying the information available about the human genome, and his book Traced gets into some of the fascinating information he's found, which challenges the evolutionary worldview and reflects the history of humanity as described in the book of Genesis. He's found information that reflects the aftermath of the flood and the scattering of humanity around the globe following the Tower of Babel. In this interview, he shares what got him going in his research, what excites him, and what he hopes to find as he continues digging into the data, and how you may be able to help with the research. If you're a man and you have a DNA test done with a service like 23andMe or Ancestry, you may have information that can help him in his continued research. I don't think we talked about where to get the book that is the focus of our discussion, and that was an oversight on my part. So before we start, I'd like to point out that it's available at masterbooks.com, and there's a link to it in the show notes, and it's also available via Amazon. Once again, this episode is available in video format. You can find it at Locals, Rumble, and YouTube. The Rumble version is embedded in the webpage where you'll find the show notes for the episode at echozoe.com/173. Along with the embedded video, you'll find an outline of the discussion, additional resources, and related episodes. Just a reminder that video is always secondary to audio, so while it's available, it's nothing fancy. In fact, the battery in the camera pointed at me died about a third of the way through the interview. However, some people prefer to watch rather than listen, so it's available if that's your preference. Look for us on social media. You can find Echo Zoe on Twitter, Truth Social, Gab, Parler, Getter, and Telegram. You can also find an up-to-date list of all these various websites at echozoe.com/linktree. I do highly recommend following me at one or more of these sites, as it helps me to get the word out when an episode is posted. Just last month, I had some frustrating website issues that prevented me from posting the episode when it was ready. And should the problems ever be so big that I can't fix them, I can let people know via social media that a resubscription to the show might be needed. Please also consider joining our locals page at echozoe.locals.com, where we are much more cancel resistant than at the big name, big tech sites. You'll find some exclusive content there, and it's also an easy way to support Echo Zoe Ministries for as little as $2 a month. Financial support is not necessary to be on the locals page either, so please don't let that deter you. In fact, I'm hearing that across all locals pages, paid subscribers and supporters only account for roughly 10% of the total user base. So come on over and follow us there, and I'm certain you'll find other local communities that you'll like as well. This episode is the second in a pair of episodes that we recorded at Answers in Genesis. Following last month's discussion with Roger Patterson, he walked me up to Nathaniel Jeanson's office, introduced us, and then we recorded this episode. My family and I really enjoyed our time at the Creation Museum, and though I've been there 4 or 5 times now, we found new and fun things to enjoy. So if you haven't been there, I do recommend it, as well as the Ark Encounter just 45 minutes or so away. Finally, I want to remind everyone about the Christian podcast community. There are tons of excellent podcasts there. And last month, it also served as a great backup for this show, given the problems I just mentioned in posting. If I can't get the post up at echozoe.com, the show will be posted independently at the Christian podcast community. You can find the alternate feed, as well as all of the other member shows at christianpodcastcommunity.org. And with that, here's my discussion with Nathaniel.
Nathaniel Jeanson? Am I pronouncing that right? Jeanson?
We say Jensen just because it's spelled like blue jeans, but I respond to many pronunciations.
Okay. Well, I don't mean to butcher your name. I apologize.
That's fine.
Thanks so much for coming on with me. I've been fascinated with your stuff for about, a year and a half, 2 years now. We're going to talk about your book a bit, Traced, genetics, Y-chromosome specifically. Sounds a bit heady, but I found it fascinating. Why don't we start a little bit with, like, you? Who are you? What's your background? How'd you come to Answers in Genesis? Kind of the 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian home, heard the gospel at a young age, said I professed faith, lived in sin for many years, most of my teen years, I'd say, enslaved to lust or pornography of one form or another. I mean, my parents were believers, so that it's not like they let anything in the house. Mm-hmm. And it's basically pre-internet days, but I'd find ways to fantasize or whatever else and tell myself that it wasn't that bad because it wasn't real pornography, So the depraved mind finds ways to excuse sin and make it less than what it is. And I'd say the gospel went from being old news to good news. Old news, I'd heard it so long. Mm-hmm. I get it, I believe it. So I said this is actually exciting. Probably partway through graduate school, trying to wrestle with some of these questions, knowing that saving faith is supposed to produce godly living, and why is this not working? What am I missing? Type thing. And to see the beauty of holiness and the hope of heaven being to enjoy the glory of God, the holy glory of God. That's if you don't see that, what's the point in a sense? And so then to see, this is to be holy is something attractive and desirable, objectively so. I guess I feel like in today's culture, beauty is often viewed as something subjective in the eye of the beholder. We have these phrases, but Scripture seems to teach and says the beauty of holiness and seems to imply, no, this is something objectively so, with some caveats, of course, depending on your theology. Mm-hmm. And I would say the unsaved person can't see it. They have some sense of it. They have a conscience. And even an unbeliever will recognize self-sacrifice of one person on the part of the other is something admirable, desirable. I mean, I can still see in my own heart. Yeah. There's ways to explain that away and suppress it. I mean, that's what Romans 1 says. The unbeliever suppresses the truth in unrighteousness. So there's still ways we still kind of, no.
Even the believer tends to at times. Yeah.
Flesh does that as well. It's not as bad as I thought it was, or not as bad as the Bible says it is, or holiness is not as beautiful as the Bible says it is. Anyway, 1,000 excuses. So after the graduate school, and that also led to a change in career thinking. So up to that point, I should also add, I grew up, I guess you could say, in a science-y, medical type home. My dad was a dentist. My mother was a nurse until she had me, and grew up with an interest in science, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. Homeschooled through 8th grade, was taken to worldview weekend conferences, heard Ken Ham, 8th grade, found my notebook from that sometime back, and went to a Christian high school that was explicitly young earth. Took the chemistry book home for whatever reason. I guess it was nerdy that way. One summer, and didn't know how I wanted to use that or where I wanted to go when I got to the point of decision for college, just because I'd seen enough blood in my dad's office that I thought, I don't really want any part of that. Yeah. And to this day, I still don't like, I look the other way when someone takes my blood. And I ended up, ironically, I did my undergraduate in molecular biology and bioinformatics, which is a mouthful technical way of saying studying life at the smallest levels, molecular levels. So DNA, RNA, protein, these are, getting inside the cell and what are the mechanics of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And then bioinformatics is simply the use of computers to process almost unmanageable amounts of data. Mm-hmm. I mean, today, for example, we'll get into Y-chromosome, I'm sure. One Y-chromosome sequence if you, first of all, they compress the file. You download it. It's almost 10 gigabytes in size. You unzip it. It's going to be 100 gigabytes in size. My hard drive in graduate school was 30 gigabytes. My Dell laptop. So
you must be younger than me, because my hard drive was 1 gigabyte.
Okay. I was in graduate school 2003, 2009, 42. Okay.
Yeah.
It's fun to look back. But yeah, how can you not have computers? Or to put it a different way, I sat down one day and thought through, okay, Y chromosome sequence or DNA sequence, your Y chromosome will be about, well, for humans, it's about 60 letters, 60 million DNA letters in size.
Wow.
The part that we can actually analyze, because there's just weird things about the Y chromosome that with current technology are difficult to assess. So there's about 10 million letters. Still, that's a big chunk. Mm-hmm. How long would it take to kind of take your finger, if you were to print out the entire sequence and just kind of go line by line, to check it by eye? And it's essentially impossible or impractical to do.
Yeah, that's just one person.
Yeah. And it's kind of sobering to think that the vast majority of what we discussed, no human has ever laid eyes upon. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't mean, it's so tiny you can't see it. That's true. But what I'm saying is, once you extract that data, no one can even look at the data, because it's just too much. So you really have to trust your computer code, or write your code in such a way that it works and produces the results you want. It's still sobering to think about. But anyway, I didn't learn to write code. What they told me as an undergraduate was, this will allow you to speak to the computer scientists, which I thought that was dumb. Now in retrospect, I can see the value of this. And trying to sort of remedially learn some of this technique, because a lot of even the software now to handle these massive files is not in Windows or these sorts of things that I find somewhat intuitive and easy to use. It's in command line and in Linux, or it's beyond your layperson level of use. So,
well, I've got a little bit of Linux, so if I can do it, I can assure you can do it too.
And that's my hope. It's just there's a learning curve and a ramp, and I've got a local contact here who's a computer guy. We're going to try to work through this, and next step is for me to get a Mac, which I've long resisted.
I did too for many years, and then I had a job with one, and now I've had one ever since. But 17 years I've been on a Mac.
Mac and trash and these sorts of phrases were ones I was taught by my
I used to
colleagues
mock
growing
the
up.
Mac people.
Yeah.
Now I am one.
Now, but is it, OS 10 is a Unix platform, and so much of this code then, they say you can either operate on Mac or you can operate in Linux, but no
and
Windows.
That's what attracted me originally, was it was post OS 10, and I had a little bit of Linux. I'm still not an expert on Linux, but I know a little bit of command line, and it translated well. So
Yeah. So that was the undergraduate, went to graduate school wanting to work on cancer, and learned a lot. I mean, I didn't use much computer stuff there, minimal, but it was learn how to do experiments, ask questions, answer them, develop testable hypotheses. I went to Harvard because they had the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and thought there would be ample opportunity to look into cancer questions. Anyway, that was the context then for sort of good news, old news becoming good news. And at that time, my goal was, before the old news became good news, the goal was, my career goal was to get a PhD, cure cancer, win the Nobel Prize, then have a platform to preach the gospel, which in theory is noble. In my case, partway through graduate school, I was able to see it was contaminated by selfish ambition.
Yeah.
And
Providence has other plans.
Yeah. Along the way, this understanding the good news, long story short, then began to say, well, how can I use my training for perhaps more immediate kingdom impact? I mean, you can go have a secular job with a PhD in biology and do great work for the Lord. It's just, in my case, I began to ask questions about missions, or almost took a trip to the Arabian Peninsula as a missionary, perhaps, to explore that possibility, do science to get into the country, and perhaps church plant, which didn't work out, and I think grace of God, because
it's dangerous work at that part of the world.
It is dangerous. My goal was to be a missionary. So my crazy ambitions were simply channeled in a new direction. Goal was to be a missionary, have the gift of singleness, and die a martyr. So now I'm married with 4 kids and working at ICR, not in the Arabian Peninsula, but we can get to that, how it's played out in a very surprising way lately in a moment. But I think looking back, I can say you probably need to be gifted pastorally or I mean, I had a lot of ambition, but I think there's certain giftings and skills you probably need to have if you're going to do it in that context. Spiritual maturity you need to have, which I didn't have. I can, not that I knew that at the time. No one wants to be told that at the time, but I can look back and say, yeah, that would have been disastrous if I would have gone plopped into that challenging environment where there's no church support except thousands of miles away back in the States type thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, by the time I got to the end of graduate school, didn't know what I was going to do, sent a resume to ICR, Institute for Creation Research, in 2009, thinking, well, maybe this is a way to use my training for more immediate kingdom impact.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I figure out what I'm going to do with my life. And was there about 6 years, then came to AIG in 2015. So I guess we're up to 7 years here now.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can say that's about 13 years of doing this experiment of how can I use my training for more immediate kingdom purposes. And so I'd say I probably used aspects of all of my training. Again, now I'm seeing the great value of being able to speak to the computer scientists
Mm-hmm.
and the need to learn more computer skills, which is ongoing, but also the lessons of graduate school in terms of how to design an experiment, how to ask the right questions, find the big questions from the lesser questions. And that was really my first task going to ICR, was develop a biology research program. So first task for me was, what are the questions that need to be answered? And in the realm of biology was sort of the parameters. Look, we've done a lot of geology, astronomy, paleontology research. Henry Morris III was the CEO, and that's basically what he said. We've done a lot of these disciplines, these fields in terms of research. We want to explore biology more intensely, which was timely because this is, at that time, is finally when a lot of these DNA sequences were beginning to be published and become publicly available. So now we have the tools by which to directly investigate this. So found the questions, began to explore it with genetics, and so running that direction. Replacing Darwin, in a sense, was the book form of here's what we found with those investigations, of which the human questions were a subset. And then just because there's so much human data out there, NIH funds it. The previous generation wants to live long, have cures for the disease, and so there's the NIH budget is $60 billion, I think, for this year. So there's massive amounts of money into getting DNA sequenced, and of course the rules are if it's government funded, it needs to be made available to the taxpayers who fund it, and so someone like me can sit here at my laptop and download the data and analyze it, and that's sort of the last 5-7 years or so investigating the human side of the story intensely, and that's what led to this book, Traced. Mm-hmm. Human DNA's Big Surprise. So there's the long and the short of it.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the question. What is the question?
Oh, the biology questions.
Yeah.
In a sense, I guess they were journalistic. Mm-hmm. How do species form? So the big question was the origin of species, I'd say.
Right.
The big overarching question.
What's the question you're going after?
Oh, for the human side.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd say, and maybe I'll tee it up with the species one because it kind of flowed out of that. There was the big origin of species question, Darwin's question, and then the specific ones under it. How do species form? From whom do they form? When do they form? Why did some go extinct? Everything around that. Mm-hmm. And you could ask similar things about humans. And just to jump ahead, I guess, one of the apologetic frameworks in which I was operating, or one of the apologetic goals that I'd say we were trying to achieve, was cast in light of what our opponents had been saying for years. So having grown up a creationist, this is something that was sort of in the back of my head the whole time, having seen it, having read creationist literature, being taught evolution, because I feel like that's good creationist education. You get taught the other side, here's what they say, and here's why we think it's wrong. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's also debate 101. If you're going to debate someone, you need to know their side better than they do.
Exactly, yeah.
So in that context, then, one of the main arguments against creation science from the evolutionary community went something like this. They were aware that the creationists had come up with lots of anti-evolutionary arguments. And I'd say there's some pretty airtight ones, even for people who wouldn't say they're young Earth creation. So Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, he's professing Catholic, is fine with billions of years of history of the universe, is fine with humans and chimpanzees having a common ancestor, but says that mutations errors in DNA operating in combination with natural selection, survival of the fittest to reproduce. He says that can't produce certain structures. And he takes a page just from Darwin himself, saying this is Darwin's test. We can now explore it at the molecular level, at the cellular level, and it fails. And that book was published, I think, in 96. So here we are, almost 25 years later. Or what are we?
26 years later.
Okay, yeah. 96, 2006, 2016. Yeah, so it's been a while. And I've been watching the evolutionists' response to this, and they don't have any answer to it. They have about 4 categories, which are either changing the subject or all the typical ways to try to address it without actually engaging his point, which is not his point. He's just taking Darwin's own point. And I say it's airtight because no one's been able to rebut it. There's strong arguments against evolution. The evolutionists have said that's not enough. I should also add there's strong arguments for design. Even Richard Dawkins recognizes, I think he defined biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Of course, he's got those qualifiers, don't believe your lying eyes. Even though it looks designed, it's not designed. Evolution can do it. But he's conceding it looks designed. That's Romans 1, of course. It's obvious. Trying to explain it away. So evolution is a form of suppressing then what your eyes clearly tell you. It looks designed. All that they say is not enough. That's what the evolutionists have said. I'm not saying this. That's what they're saying. Anti-evolutionary arguments, pro-design arguments, not enough. Well, what does it require? They say it has to be testable predictions, making statements that future experiments can either disprove.
That's an interesting standard, because how much of their own worldview holds up to that?
Yes. So I'd say it is the standard of science. If you think about gravity, or what gives me confidence that when I sit down in the seat of a Boeing 767 and fly to Europe, it's going to take off. Well, it's because gravity has made predictions. The laws of physics have made predictions. They've been confirmed over and over and over again. So, I'm just going to sit down and think about if we're going to crash. Yeah. Unless there's some sort of crazy weather where, then how do you model those physics? But in general, we're not sitting here hoping that I wake up and suddenly the laws of physics have changed or we've missed something. Mm-hmm. But it is a valid question then to say, does the evolutionary model itself meet that gold standard of science? And I think you'd be hard pressed to see it. Just to give an example, I think I don't have the book here, but I think I had the book at ICR, or they did, in the library, from Sean Carroll. I think it was called "Endless Forms Most Beautiful," talking about progress in evolutionary developmental biology. So studying you might think of like Ernst Haeckel's drawings about embryology recapitulates phylogeny, something like that. It's not quite that, but it's the idea of as humans develop in the womb, or animals develop in the womb, or whatever it is, as you go from a single cell that's sperm fertilizes egg to birth, hatching, whatever, how does that show evolution? And of course, they're going to use genetics. They're going to use molecular biology, DNA, RNA comparisons to say, does the cellular mechanics that control chicken development have any parallels to humans? So he'd say yes. But he tells this really interesting story that speaks to this idea, does evolution even meet its own standard? He quotes Ernst Haeckel, not Ernst Haeckel, he quotes Ernst Mayr, I think, who was writing in the 1950s, or whatever the date was. It was pre-genetic era. And Mayr was, and maybe someone else, but it was a prominent evolutionist, making a claim, essentially a testable prediction, where he said evolution's been going on for so long, millions of years. When we get DNA sequences, which they hadn't yet, we're never going to find the similarities among these various species because they've just been mutating for so long. Any previous similarity between the development in the common ancestor of humans and chickens is going to have been lost, but they've been mutating for millions of years. And Carroll was quoting him saying, this is what we thought. Now we see that one of the genes, sections of DNA that controls eye development in fruit flies or mice, you can also controls eye development in humans. And anyway, his point is that there's this, you've probably heard the term homology, homo being the same, homo sapiens, homosexual, same sex. Homology, the study of similarity, sameness among biology. There's evidence for evolution. Darwin, of course, used homology at the anatomical level.
So wait a second. Now they're first saying that this was evidence that we shouldn't see the similarities, and then they're saying that when you do see the similarities, that proves evolution?
So Ernst Mayr, whoever it was back in the 50s, was saying, essentially predicting, based on evolution, hundreds of millions of years of mutation, you should not see similarities. Carroll was telling that story to say, well, here we are, as an evolutionist, he's writing this, here we are in the 1990s or 2000s,
the similarities
whatever.
we didn't expect prove our worldview.
And that's textbook evidence of evolution. So what should have been the falsification of evolution is now the textbook evidence of it. And so there's an example of, is evolution actually a scientific idea? Does it make predictions that we can...
Well, it doesn't sound like it's disprovable, because when you do, by their own standard, they just change the standard.
So if it can explain everything, because you just keep working and massaging it and doing all this to twist it to fit whatever the data says, it doesn't explain anything. It's not a scientific idea. So I think we have evidence to say, no, evolution does not meet that standard. And part of what I was pursuing, what I began to pursue then, when I started at ICR in 2009, was, can the creation model in biology come up with testable predictions? So, to put it maybe in more concrete terms, the evolutionist might say, fine, there's things we can't explain when it comes to the origin of species. There's molecular structures. Michael Behe, we can't answer what he's saying. Not that they put it this way, I'm just, let's say hypothetically. Yep. This is kind of how it would go. We can see there's issues for which we don't yet have answers in evolution. And yes, biology gives the appearance of design, but until you come up with something predictable, and here's something concrete, they might say, few recognize this, but let's say they do. They recognize that creationists believe God creates kinds of creatures, not species, kinds of creatures, so not a lion and a tiger and an ocelot and a jaguar.
Just a big cat.
And Noah takes two cats, a male and a female, on board the ark of the cat kind, the cat family. From those two then speciate after the flood the 30 plus species of cats, large and small, we see today. They'll say, okay, we recognize all that, but what predictions does that make? Can you predict for us how many new cat species will form this year, or this decade, or this century? Give us something we can go out into the field and test. Predict for us how fast or slow the house cat's DNA is going to mutate, or the lion's DNA is going to mutate. Just give us something that hasn't been measured yet, that your model makes predictions of. And until you do, they've said, you have no place at the scientific table. And this has worked its way into federal court decisions. So 1982 was a landmark decision. I think it was about the Arkansas Board of Education. I forget the exact title of the lawsuit, but at stake was whether or not you could teach creation science in the public school classrooms. And the judge said no, and this was part of his reasoning, because creation science doesn't make testable predictions, he says. And of course, 87, I think, was the Supreme Court decision. It might have to do with Louisiana, but it's the same sort of constant drumbeat for 40 years, no testable predictions, which of course is not true.
Well, it also sounds like they're just saying you got to make a prediction. You don't have to be right. You just have to make the prediction. Because they made the prediction that the similarities shouldn't be there in different kinds, different species. You talk about the fruit flies or whatever, and the mice and the people. They made a prediction that didn't come true.
Yes, I'd say that's true to a degree. I think that's, in a sense, what they're implying. If we hold creation science to the evolutionary standard.
Right, which of course
which is
can't.
Low.
Yeah.
I still think the idea of you need to propose, if you propose science that works, science is pragmatic in a sense, which you could also then conclude it's a poor way to know the world, because its ultimate goal isn't necessarily to know the truth, because we don't have absolute premises from which we can derive conclusions. It's just observations, and well, I think this explanation works, so I'm going to test it, and if it keeps working, I just keep running with it until it stops working, and then I discard it and I come up with something new. And so it's a powerful way to know the world, but if you want to know absolute things about the world, it's very weak.
Yeah.
But this is what we have right now with our ignorance and finiteness, and we chase it. So at a minimum, creationists should come up with predictions that can be evaluated, which has been done in geology. The RATE project is one example with radiometric dating and such that precedes me even starting at ICR. And I think Russ Humphreys has made predictions in astronomy, and there's a list you could come up with, which empirically refutes that claim against creation science. Now we also have biology, replacing Darwin. Traced itself is, in a sense, a fulfillment of predictions in replacing Darwin. This is a long-winded way of answering that. What's the question? So one of the predictions replacing Darwin made, which isn't necessarily unique to me, it's easily derivable, if human history goes back to the flood, because the Bible implies then humanity starts with Adam and Eve, but then they had a bunch of offspring, 1700 years, and then they all got destroyed.
It was a big reset.
Yeah, and all that civilization got destroyed, buried under layers of sediment, or just wiped off the face of the earth. And restarts with Noah and his family, so Egypt and Sumer and the Yellow River civilization and the Indus Valley civilization, all that history post-flood. And so you should see that echo in our DNA. Very different for evolution, because they stretch out anatomically modern human history over hundreds of thousands of years. And so Sumer and Egypt and the Yellow River Valley, all that is the very tail end of evolutionary history. And so therefore, when your time scale is this long and you've got just this little tiny piece down here, it's almost impossible to find the echoes of that. Anyway, but if this is human history and this is post-flood history, it should be boom, 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 boom. You should be able to read it off really easy. And that's kind of the point of the book Traced. It fulfills the predictions. It makes more. So I'd say creation science is meeting the standards of what evolutionists have demanded and exceeding them. So that's part of the reason for the title Replacing Darwin. It's not just we're rebutting him, we're going beyond him, beyond evolution, Darwin just being the placeholder for evolution in whatever form it is today, and taking the lead in science. And Traced, in a sense, isn't primarily an apologetic book. It's primarily a history book because it's working. We're making sense of this, of the history that we know, using this DNA to make discoveries about the world that we hadn't had access to before. It happens to be one of the most powerful apologetic arguments, I think, in print, because it is, by showing we can do science and it's succeeding, we're showing this is all wrong that we've been accused of. And if this is working so well, why are we even talking about evolution anymore? What's the point? Yeah. It's an inferior idea that we can discard and move on from and chase the stuff that's actually working. So in that sense, it's this decades long, it's a refutation of a decades-old argument that resets this whole debate, puts the young earth creation science on offense, biblical authority on offense, because that's the framework in which we're interpreting the world, resets the science versus religion debate. In this case, the biblical framework was the key to getting to science that is working and is exceeding what other people are doing in terms of its ability to anticipate what's going to happen next, make predictions, that sort of thing. Again, I go back to gravity, physics, these make predictions that we rely on. That's what good science should be. That's where creation science is now, which is remarkable. And it really is not a testament to any person. I mean, it's a small band of people, ragtag bunch of people who shouldn't be able to make these sorts of discoveries. It's a testament ultimately to the scripture is true.
The worldview behind it.
So sometimes it's like shooting fish in a barrel because it's there, but no one bothers to look for it because, well, we've just rejected it from the start. That's Bible, that's religion. Sorry, we just do science here. Well, you're missing it. You've taken what should be obvious echoes of history, and you stretched out that time scale like a rubber band, and now what should be obvious is kind of lost, and you let go of the rubber band, snaps back into place, and then the answers become obvious.
That's I don't want to get too sidetracked with my own little anecdote here, but on the way down here, I live in Minneapolis area, and we're driving down on Saturday, and one of the things I listen to on the way down here is it's a podcast called World's Greatest Con, and he goes through different con artists, and he did a season on this World War II plot to get Hitler to go the wrong direction in the military. But he's always doing a second season, and he's talking about game shows. And he brought up, do you remember Press Your Luck? There's no whammies. So the contestants get a board where once they answer a question right, they get a chance at a board where there's a bunch of squares, and the light goes around the different squares and randomly, and each square has a prize. But then there's a whammy, which is like a bad guy, and you're done. It's like the bankrupt on Wheel of Fortune. And so you're hoping to hit a prize. And as long as you keep hitting prizes, you can keep going. And then you press your luck, because if you hit a whammy, you lose everything you built up. Well, there's a guy who was studying it on VCR back in the early 80s and realized that the pattern that the lights were moving there's only 5 patterns. And there were 2 squares that never came up with a whammy. So he gets himself on the show because he's like, I got this thing gamed out, and figures out, and he ends up getting his prize pool up over $100,000, which is in today's dollars, over $250,000, which they say is for a single episode game show is still the standing record that anybody's ever won on a game show. But I bring it up because you said like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, you've got with this biblical worldview is your pattern that nobody else sees, where he can see, you know, on the board, and all you got to do is just hit the button at the right time, and you're coming up over and over again.
Yeah. And it's not that it's been without challenges. Mm-hmm. There were points in which I was sweating, basically, trying to figure out human history and what does this mean. And here's this section of the family tree where these peoples go this way, these peoples go that way, and I have no idea what history corresponds to it. Mm-hmm. In most of these cases, it was simply I was ignorant of history. And once last history course I took was in high school, you know, world history, which I realized in retrospect is basically, for probably many of us, history of Western civilization.
Greek and Roman. And
history of India, history of Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, which plays a huge role, of course.
Yeah, well, that's one thing
in genetics.
As I'm reading, you talk a lot about Central Asia, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I ran my own DNA based on what you had in the book, and found that my DNA line comes from Central Asia, which was a bit of a shock. And I have a lot of questions there. I don't know if that's your area, but it raises questions historically, not necessarily genetically. But.
Yes, and I will say, make a pitch to anyone watching, that we are looking for anyone who's taken a DNA test or anyone who wants to participate in future research, because we're making testable predictions and chasing them, to write into us. So we've got a web form, answersingenesis.org, so our homepage, /go/traced, just the name of the book. And this takes you to, well, there's a supplemental table section in the book as well. Appendix 1 gives that same website, but takes you to a page. You can just scroll down, enter your name, email, phone number. We put that there because I've had people from around the globe write in, and apparently in Sub-Saharan Africa, phone is better than internet. So you put your phone in or email and a message. It goes directly to my inbox, and I can correspond. And we've had 600 to 700 people respond this way. Again, from around the globe, a surprising number of Muslims who've been interested. There's just so many questions to keep pursuing. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So yes, very much.
Well, I definitely want to get into that. I mean, because I found the book fascinating, and we haven't even really touched on the meat of Traced yet. And before that, I went through, you did like a 24, 25 hour-long videos with Ken Ham on much of the same material. And I was binge watching all that.
Okay.
And it was shortly after the lockdowns and stuff I found it. And I think you'd had most of it done when I started, so I was able to binge. And that's why I was excited to come when I'm coming to Cincinnati. I said, I got to get in. And I know Roger, so we did an episode with Roger. And then Andrew Rappaport set me up with your publicist to get me in here with you. And I've been excited for better part of a month to come and talk about this because I found it so fascinating, and I thought you did a great job presenting it. But what's the meat behind Traced now? In that human history and the DNA that you kind of set up for us.
Yeah. So I say again, this is first and foremost a history book with these massive apologetic ramifications. But history, just because it's working. If you have this biblical framework, and you go to our DNA and say, can you see the echoes of civilization? You know, all these things we learn about in school, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, and so on. It should be there. You should be able to make sense of it. And that's essentially the point of the book. But the organization of the book is, and let me back up a second and to put it in the context of that 25-part series, which is a little bit seat of the pants in a sense. I had drafted a book prior to COVID hitting, a short little book about just the research at that time. And then COVID hit, lockdowns happened, and so everything goes online. And I said, well, I've got some of this material. And it just kept going, where in a sense, we started with that preliminary material I had, which was sort of worked up, which in a sense, if you have the Trace book, the first couple chapters were things I'd worked up in this early, very small booklet, in a sense. And but a lot of what's in Traced was beginning to be developed in 2020, and then all the more so thereafter, next year or so, 12 months. But the way I ended up organizing Traced was to say, let's try to find one major civilization from each habitable region or continent, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, East Asia, so on, Pacific, Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And tried to answer the question that I feel like most history books leave out, that my history book left out, and that's not a criticism. I'll explain why in a moment. But it's the question of what happens to the peoples. So if we read about the Roman Empire and the founding of Rome in the 700s BC, and the fall of at least the Western Roman Empire in the 400s BC, and of course the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire with the Ottomans in the 1400s AD. Yeah, 400s AD, sorry, in the 1400s AD.
Yep.
What happens before and after? So think about it from a biblical perspective. Put the flood, just for sake of simple math, about 2500 BC, roughly, give or take maybe a few centuries. 700s BC is almost 2,000 years.
Yeah.
After that, so who did the Romans come from? And whoever they came from, what were they doing for 2,000 years?
Mm-hmm.
Just hanging out in Europe? I mean, did they come from the Middle East? There's just this big blank spot where they just kind of pop into existence, and then they disappear. They're conquered.
A little village on the Tiber. And...
Yeah. So what is the rest of the story of the peoples themselves? Or to make it personal, someone who's Italian or Italian American, can they legitimately claim that these great Romans, that great empire of old, those people were legitimately their ancestors? Did they become the modern Italians, or did they disappear? Did they become somebody else? Most of Europe. History books can't answer this because the tools you need to answer these questions are, number one, either some sort of comprehensive genealogy. And I don't mean simply the royal genealogy, because we have some of those. You can trace the royal house of whatever, England.
The Caesars into the...
Yeah. But we need the genealogies of the common person.
Yeah.
To say the Roman Empire of whatever it was, 30 million people. What happened to them? We don't have that, of course. So the other way you can try to answer this question is with DNA, which of course we haven't had. DNA isn't established as the substance of heredity until the 1950s. Mm-hmm. So you can't go answering these questions prior to then. You don't have the human DNA sequence, which is the most relevant one here, until the early, 2000s, I think, if I remember my timeline right. Yeah.
Yeah, I seem to remember the announcement of the full sequencing was around 2000, 2001.
Yes, I'm thinking it was
watching a tech
Clinton.
show.
It was Clinton, so maybe it was the early 90s.
2000.
Okay.
Because I was watching a tech show, not a believer by any stretch. And in fact, the guy's quite hostile to believers.
Yeah.
I still kind of follow the guy, but for the tech side, not for the worldview side. And I remember I'd been saved in 99. I was in the last year of college, so it was 2000, 2001. And I remember him coming on and saying, we got the DNA sequence. And it disproves those creationists. And
yes.
I was only a year a believer. And so I had a little crisis of faith for a moment. How would people say that? Of course, I quickly just got over it. Thought, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
You're right. Now that rings a bell for me, too, because I remember being in lab. So I'd been, as an undergraduate, my undergraduate was 99 to 2003. Mm-hmm. And I got into a lab, it would have been at least 2000. I think by the time I got into the lab, I was there for 3 years. My principal investigator coming in handing out papers to the graduate students. Human genome is sequenced, boom, boom, boom. So, yes, maybe it was the end of the Clinton years then. But Francis Collins,
Bush was elected
in
2000, so he didn't take office until 2001.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. So, very recent.
Yeah.
And then what else is shown in the book is most of our DNA is a rather poor tool to go back deep in history to answer that question of peoples, because of the two-edged sword of basic biology. You get DNA from both parents, great. Now you get both sides of your family tree. But that also means you're 50% of each parent, they're 50% of each parent, and now on back you go. So I'm 25% genetically grandparent.
Yep.
12.5% great-grandparent. And so boom, 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 that percentage drops off real fast. And you could say practically then the dirty little secret of most genetic testing companies is they're not going to tell you much more than what you already know from your basic family tree. Because how many of us can go back to grandparents, great-grandparents?
Right,
I think my dad has gone back to maybe the third great or something on one of our sides.
Yeah.
And that test is not going to take you back hardly further than that with any sort of reliability. So why is there this whole book then on human history? The Y-chromosome, and I should say there's actually two types of DNA that get inherited from only one side. So in this case, then, if it's from dad, you don't have mom's DNA diluting the genetic signal. If it's from mom, you don't have dads diluting her genetic signal. Mitochondrial DNA comes from mom for reasons nobody knows why. There's a tremendous amount of statistical noise. And so I've had a lot of people write in saying, hey, can you tell me my history from my mitochondrial DNA? Would love to, I'm sorry, but if you get your mitochondrial DNA, I get my mitochondrial DNA, we compare our sequences, and I say, it looks like we had a common ancestor in the 8500s. Well, this noise is such that I'll say plus or minus 1,000 years. It could be that we had the time of the ancient Greeks, or it could be the time of the Middle Ages. And that's not
quite a big gap.
Yeah, that's a gigantic range that tells you very little historical information. So
It's almost sad because we all have mitochondrial DNA, but we get it from our mothers.
Yes. As
opposed to Y chromosome, where only males.
Yes. So the mitochondrial DNA, as far as we can tell, is only through mom so egg and sperm both have it, but when sperm meets egg, it's the tail of the sperm that has the mitochondria that drops off. It doesn't enter the egg. The head of the sperm does, which has the vast majority of your DNA.
Sure.
The egg cell doesn't have any of this breaking up of itself like the sperm cell does, and so it retains its mitochondrial DNA. There's still some debate over if that's exactly how it works, but that seems to be the case with the Y chromosome. Get into transgender issues. Females are XX, males are XY. This biology hasn't changed. Only males pass on the Y chromosome. So there's no female DNA to dilute it, and there's in theory, then, a tool by which to measure generations. Now, how can DNA reconstruct a family tree? Family trees record ancestry, who you come from. Apart from DNA, if I just have a written record, this is my mom, this is my dad, this is the name of their parents, and so on. And even using those terms has the implicit concept of time. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents tells you generations. Well, DNA, of course, I think everyone recognizes, records the who, because paternity testing makes that assumption.
Yeah.
Who's my daddy? Get your DNA tested, and you can find out who that man is. The time element for Y chromosome, so I should add here, the Y chromosome, again, for reasons unknown, has less statistical noise. So if you get your Y chromosome sequence, I get my Y chromosome sequence, and I say we had a common ancestor in the 1400s, plus or minus 100 years maybe. That's fairly precise.
That's much better than...
Yeah. So we can say this is, let's look in this range of European events, presumably, is where we have a common ancestor. I know my family goes back to Europe. And you can be much more precise. So how can you actually get a time point? Well, because we live in a fallen world, when the Y chromosome is passed on from fathers to sons, it is copied in sperm stem cells, technically, passed on to sperm, in an imperfect way. And on average, so I mentioned that the Y chromosome is about 60 million letters long, only about 10 million letters are actually...
that was just the Y chromosome?
Just the Y chromosome. So the total DNA sequence, one copy of it, let's say from dad or mom, is about 3.2 billion letters.
Wow.
The other parent supplies the other 3.2 billion letters, 3.259, whatever the number is currently. And the Y chromosome is a small chromosome, say only 60 million letters long, 10 million accessible. And of that 10 million, about on average, in most lineages, about 3 mistakes occur per generation. Tiny needle in a haystack, but that's enough then to sort of mark the passage of time. You compare my son's Y chromosome to mine, about 3 differences. You compare my son's Y chromosome to my dad's, their grandfathers, should be about 6 Y chromosome differences. And so the number of DNA differences marks time. If you compare yours to mine, we count the number of DNA differences. You can kind of divide by 3 or by 6 if you think we're separate branches.
Sure.
That tells you how many generations ago then we find our common paternal ancestor. You do that around the globe, now you've got a global family tree, and you can begin to answer these questions of which part is the Roman branch, which is the Sumerian branch, which is the East Asian branch, the ancient Chinese branch, and so on, to find out who they came from, and then what happened to these people, if they're still there.
Yeah.
Maybe there is no Roman signature. That's part of the question that this book tries to answer. And so we go through Egypt for Africa, and Rome for Europe, and Persia for the Middle East, and so on. And what I claim in the book is, what we'll find is, even though we're looking at just one civilization, because there's so much interconnectedness among the peoples of the globe, you end up telling the story of the whole globe, which itself is kind of, I don't want to run too much of the surprise, but there's a double meaning there too, because yes, the book explains 99% of the stories of the people on the globe, but 95% of these stories, or branches, you could say, on the family tree, have originated in the last 600 years. It's a quirk of how human population history
Yeah.
has worked. It's totally non-intuitive.
Yeah.
Another way of saying it is you and I have a 95% chance of having the same common ancestor just 600 years ago. And so the flip side is most of the really interesting stuff that deals with ancient history is buried in the rare lineages, which is why we want more participants, because statistically some of these rare lineages will come out. And so, someone watching may have in their DNA the lineage of the ancient Sumerians, which we haven't found yet, or the Assyrians, and on the list goes. So that's sort of the big picture. Here's what we're trying to explain, the story of peoples, the history of peoples of the globe, how much we can explain so far, and how much is still left to be done. Lots of predictions that this book holds that we're now pursuing going forward, and that I'm really excited to find out where it goes.
Yeah. Now, I assume when you talk about an average, just speaking on average, 3 mutations in the Y chromosome per generation, that it's going to be different mutations. So I have 3 sons that I don't necessarily have the same 3 mutations. And then my dad had 3 brothers. So my cousins, my male cousins and their kids are going to have different 3 or 6, depending on the generational gap differences.
Yeah. As best as we can tell, the mutations seem to occur fairly randomly. Now, you can do the math and say, okay, we've got 10 million letters of sequence, 8 billion people in the globe, almost, assume half are men, 4 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the statistical chance that if my DNA...
Well, what's the commonality then amongst the 4 million men? Like, how many of those 10 million letters are identical on all 4 billion men?
Oh, okay, yes. So I'd say 99% of us are identical. It's fairly easy then for me to score differences between my DNA and yours, because the vast, there's only been about 150 generations since Noah. That's
okay. So
150 times
450
3.
differences between all men on the planet Earth?
On average, among most non-African men, some of the African branches have longer lineages for reasons still unknown. I think it's because they have some...
Reproduce faster? Are they having children younger? We're having children younger? We're having children younger? So you might have 4 or 5 generations where the rest of us only have 2 or 3?
That's a possibility I think it's a real possibility if you think of the maternal line. And the reason I say that is there was UN data from the 1970s showing that African women tended to marry younger or have children younger than non-African.
Okay.
So there's something that plays a role.
It's not explaining the Y side, though.
Right. I don't think we saw that same difference among men. Now, it's 1970s, so what does that say about...
It's 50 years ago.
600 yeyears ago. I don't know. That's an open question. Mm-hmm. But I think even if you reduce the generation time, if men and women all marry and have kids younger, there are still branches that are long enough. I don't think you can get enough generations. So I think there's still something in which the DNA mutates faster, and here's my best guess at this point. Again, here's a testable prediction. My prediction is that if you measure father-son differences in some of these long, primarily African branches, though there's some Caucasians too who belong to them. One of them who wrote into us.
Yeah,
and,
that little story, the African-American man who wasn't too excited to hear about a common ancestor.
Oh, there was an African-American man who belonged to the same branch as me, which is one of the average length branches. Mm-hmm. I was thinking of someone who written in who belonged to one of the really long branches, which I assumed because they're found basically in Southwest Africa and in Sudan. I'd be talking to perhaps an African-American. He was pasty light-skinned as I was. And so kind of had to get over my initial shock and, okay. But I think there are rare levels of this long branch in Europe, partly because you've got, when the Islamic conquest came up out of the Arabian Peninsula and through North Africa into Spain and sat there for several centuries, I think they picked up some of these Sudanese lineages along the way. You can see sub-branches in here, and I think it's the Sudanese sub-branch. So my guess is that's how it got into Europe. Then, of course, the European migration to the Americas brings it over here. But my prediction is, you can measure father-son mutation rates in these long branches, see that it goes faster. Why does it go faster? There's already published data for sub-Saharan Africans that they undergo another type of genetic change at a faster rate or more frequently. So this is sort of a side story, deals with a different compartment of DNA, not the Y chromosome, but the DNA we get from both parents. Mm-hmm. And the reason we look like a mix of our parents and really sometimes look more like our grandparents than our parents is because dad's DNA, he doesn't pass on, so he's got a version from dad, a version from his mom, or his dad, his mom. He doesn't just pass on grandpa's version or grandma's version to me or one of his kids, he first mix and matches the grandpa and grandma versions and passes on a combination of those to me.
Mm-hmm.
Recombination is the process, this type of genetic change. You're not mutating it where you're changing the letters, you're just kind of swapping versions.
Okay.
So that I will have from my dad actually a mix of his parents' version. Same thing for my mom.
Mm-hmm.
This has been measured. This is a paper in 2011 in the journal Nature, one of the top journals in the world. They compared, I think, Caucasian Americans to African Americans, and they found that the African Americans do more swapping.
Okay.
They also, it appears, retain in this compartment of DNA more of the original from Adam and Eve.
Oh,
so
that's interesting.
Someone will say, well, you're saying the Y chromosomes are longer, they're more mutant. You can try to go that direction, but if you look at this compartment, you'll have to say they're also more original because they look more like Adam and Eve. They preserved more.
Noah and his wife.
They're less inbred than Caucasians. So there's weird stuff however you want to twist it. So I just don't go those directions.
Well, that's interesting that you bring that term up, because you haven't mentioned that yet in our discussion, but you did in the book about how when you're going 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, and then 16 and 32, it doesn't just keep fanning out all the way back. It's eventually got to come back on itself, and you end up having, somewhere in your ancestry that you might have second or third cousins married each other, so they go back to the same person.
Yes, and anyone can do this sort of math, and we've tried to test this empirically.
Well, I thought that was kind of interesting because I did some of my own. When my oldest son, who's 15, was born, I took a paternity leave. My wife did her maternity leave, and she went back to work, and then I thought, well, I'll stay home for a couple months and get to know my newborn son. And, well, babies sleep a lot, so I ended up with a lot of free time, and one of the things I did was I thought, I'm going to get into my family tree. And I did notice that, and I don't know how accurate my sources were, but I did notice that back in the several hundred years ago in Norway, that I started seeing that some 5th great grandma and 5th great grandpa had a common ancestor.
Yeah. And you and I will likely find, if I was able to go beyond my 3rd grandparent level, 3rd great grandparent level, eventually find some connection to you. We try to do this genetically, basically. So just to back up a minute for context, because I have to do this for myself. I say 600 years ago, we're talking about 1400s, so just after Black Death ends. And some of the people who've written in, who've done their genealogy, one of the guys I talked to said, it's kind of hard to find records beyond that point, or even maybe a century before that point. Church records and such, or whatever else you'd consult to document family history. So I've done my Y chromosome, which would be my dad's Y chromosome then as well, except for 3 differences. On my mother's side, so it's not that ladies are left out of this. Men and women both have to deal with what about the female side? You just find a male relative. So we had my mother's brother get his Y chromosome tested. We're hoping we can do my mother's brother, my dad's mother's brother, somewhere along those, so I sort of fill it out. Yep. And we already found a connection genetically between the 2 lines. So, but that's, again, exactly in line with what the math predicts. This is, and just to clarify then, this is not if you know your records, therefore you'll probably come together. It doesn't matter if you know anyone in your family tree. It's just basic math of sexual reproduction. You have 2 parents instead of 1. So those 2 parents have 2 parents, which have 2. So I have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. There's this doubling, exponential doubling, and it grows way faster than anyone anticipates, so that by the time you get to 1000 AD, going back 1,000 years, you have more, in theory, ancestors, whatever that is, great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, than were people alive on the planet, which can't possibly be true. You reconcile this apparent mathematical discrepancy, and that's just me. From my parents, and so on. You reconcile it by bringing the branches together. You connect the branches. That lowers the number of ancestors. Well, it lowers it by making those ancestors some of the same. And so maybe it's a little weird, but all of us then are going to be more related to ourselves than we think, because the mom and dad's lines are going to come together. They have to make the math work.
Well, the Answers in Genesis is dealing with that question all the time, where the first criticism an unbeliever asks is what? Who did Cain marry, or who did Abel marry? Who did Seth marry? They're asking who. Obviously, it was his sister, because that's the only option. And we look back in just more recent European history. Common people didn't generally leave about a 20-mile radius from where they were born. They would never leave that area. They were born there, they lived there, they died there. they never left. So I mean, they have to find their spouse there. And that pool was not only small, but it had always been small.
I was talking with one of my German relatives, who I don't think is a professing believer, and talking through some of this math, and his comment to me was kind of like the same thing you were saying, which is these small German towns, you don't need to tell me that there's probably a lot more connections on this family tree. We kind of all expect that because you just don't go that very, very far from your hometown. There aren't that many options. And so, yes, you're going to be marrying relatives. I mean, we're all relatives because we go back to Adam and Eve and Noah and his family. Yes, exactly. But it's just a lot closer than many of us have realized. Yeah. And this is not something unusual. It just that's the way it works out mathematically. And again, even to people who have no reason to agree with the creationist view, kind of concede, that's just Europe for you.
Well, I don't think we've even touched much of the surface of the book, and I'm hoping people will be inspired to read it. I'm going to put links to the show notes, which will be echozoe.com/173, to the book, of course, but also the YouTube, not only the series, but it's in a playlist, so I'll put the playlist link and people can watch. But I did, because I saw you get excited before we started, I did run my own Y-chromosome, because my wife and I did 23andMe 5-6 years ago. And in the book you talk about haplogroups, which we haven't used that word in a discussion yet.
Yeah.
But, these common ancestors on the Y chromosome tree. And you described how to do that, how to find that. And so I went on my 23andMe and I found out that I'm an R1A. And you seemed excited to see that when I walked in and showed you the 23andMe. So can we talk a little bit about that side of what you're doing?
Yes, and this is probably helpful to talk about some of the bigger applications of this. So again, it's primarily a history book to try to trace the history of these civilizations, the who they came from and what happened to them after the civilization fell politically. Mm-hmm. But all of our stories get caught up in that because they all connect. Yeah. We just did the math of if I go through my mother's side, my dad's side, those are going to connect, but that applies for every single person. So all of our family trees are going to connect at some point. Me and an African American, me and a Chinese American, there's connections that no one anticipates. That's what this book shows, and so it gets personal for every person, as your results show. And one of the things I put in the back of the book, you've probably seen this. Yep. But this whole middle section right here, 176 pages or so, is the 235 color plates. There's a section in the back for, hey, if you've taken a genetic test, find your haplogroup, which is just the technical term for brand. Mm-hmm. Find your result right here. Tells you which son of Noah. So we can see at the beginning of this DNA-based Y chromosome male inherited DNA tree a mirror image of Genesis 10. Yep. Genesis 10 has about 70 names roughly. We don't yet see 70 branches, but we have 99% of the world's been left to test. So those are still out there, I think, left to be discovered. That's part of what we're doing.
We hope. They didn't die off in a black death.
Exactly. Looking for the lost peoples of the ancient world. And
that's another interesting angle, is that what you're seeing, you're only seeing the survivors of wars and plagues and famines and whatnot. We don't have the DNA of those who died. Yes. And this is especially true in the Americas. So as this book gets into history, it gets into so-called prehistory. So the pre-Columbian Americas is considered prehistory because it's viewed as not having written records like you do in Europe and the Middle East and such. This research explodes it because we can look at the DNA of Native Americans and it shows that they're not the first ones here. There's been several settlings. It's been a dynamic place. The natives themselves apparently recorded this. I've got in the book, I talk about the Delaware account of their own origins. Since the book came out, I found that the Incas themselves talk about them arriving, or their story starts about the 500s AD, which is exactly when this lineage that I say is the dominant lineage on the Americas comes over from Central Asia. Another prediction that came true, huh?
It was really exciting. And it also implies that there may still be, we know archaeologically the Mayans were here before that time, the Olmecs were here. If they didn't get totally slaughtered or replaced or whatever died out, there still may be a yet undiscovered lineage in the Americas that'll rewrite this history, prehistory. So history, prehistory, biblical history has been confirmed. I should say we've got the line, we can see a clear echo of the line of Abraham, Isaac, I should say Abraham. In the book I say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've had enough Muslims write to me that I thought, can I say that it's Isaac instead of Ishmael? I don't know yet, because they're in the same spots. And
Sure.
where you see these lineages that are clearly Abrahamic are places where Jews and Muslims exist to this day. So one of the things I'm hoping we can do among the 175 million males or so that are still in the Middle East is look for some of these lineages to be able to figure out, is this Ishmael, is this Isaac, are there some of the lost tribes of Israel, is this the line of Judah? Anyway, it's clearly Abrahamic, I can say that, because Genesis 10 gives us the genealogical structure of Shem down through Eber and Peleg, and Genesis 11 down to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or to Abraham at least, and then the rest of Genesis, Isaac and Jacob and such, and his 12 sons. So that's one of the discoveries of this book as well. And if someone takes a Y-chromosome test like you did, we can then connect that lineage back to a specific son of Noah, so in this case R1A, which is a brother group to R1B, which is what my paternal line is, and I should clarify, because I get caught up in this myself. That's just one sliver of my family line. There's
it's just the
dad's
males
mom's side and mom's. Anyway, there's more to that comes into making me. But I can say that R1A, R1B both go back to a son of Joktan, who was a descendant of Shem. So we're Semitic in that sense, not Jewish per se, but Semitic through Shem. And in chapter 13, this book goes through some of the lines of evidence biblically and genetically. In a sense, in chapters 5 through 12, so 1 through 4, sort of intro and setting the stage for this is going to be some shocking stuff. So let's make sure you're prepared for it. Some of those numbers, the equations we just talked about, we run through those. So when I tell you something crazy, it actually makes mathematical sense. And then chapter 5 begins with Egypt and Africa and such, and through 12 through the Americas, sort of building branch by branch a case for this is who I think this corresponds to. Then 13 is where we get into, here's what the Bible says about what became of the men in Genesis 10. About half the minute gives us something explicit or implicit, either they kind of stayed here in the Mediterranean, or Asher, son of Shem, became the Assyrians, and you can make those cases. The other half of the names are ones that the Bible says nothing about. It lists the name in Genesis 10. It relists the name in Chronicles, First Chronicles, whatever it is, and then it says nothing else. My thought was the Bible says very little about the histories in certain places of the globe. There are global statements, for sure. But if you say, does the Bible tell us the dynasty by dynasty history of China? No. Does it tell us the chieftain by chieftain, reign by reign rule of people in sub-Saharan Africa? No. The focus is on, in the Old Testament, Israel and its neighbors, and then in the New Testament, Jesus, and of course the ministry of the apostles, and Paul and such. It has this very Near Eastern Mediterranean focus by design, and so there are other places that it doesn't speak to explicitly, the Americas and such. So my thought was you have names in which the Bible says very little about their fates, just lists the names in Genesis 10. Then you have places in which you don't really have the explicit histories. You match up these two unknowns, these guys become candidates for populating these places, and it works out beautifully, just point by point. And even you can count off at the base of the tree, generation by generation. Here's Shem, here's his son Arphaxad, boom, 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 down to Eber. You can count those off. It's really remarkable. It was at that point that I said, this is where Noah is. I had a version of this book in February 2021, almost ready to go to press, where I hadn't figured this out. We ran into a snafu in March. So in April was, I guess, I like to think it's not a midlife crisis, but thinking through, I'm 41 or whatever, turning 41, what I want to accomplish before I die type thing. And realized, yes, it's nice to be able to read off people's history within a young earth framework, but if I go to New Guinea and say, hey, I can make sense of your history within 4,500 years, does it really make that big a difference? Is it relevant to them? If instead it was, your history starts with this guy in Genesis 10, now it's biblically relevant. So that's when I went back and said, let's do a concordance search of these names. I'm not a Hebrew guy. It was really simple search. But then all the pieces came together. I said, okay, now we can say this is where Noah's in the tree because it lines up and ticks all these boxes for the biblical data. And then when I told it to a retired Bible translator who'd been to New Guinea, I mean, he's Caucasian, but he was excited, saying, this is great. Now, he said one of the issues, of course, we run into is, if
their mythology doesn't match.
Mythology doesn't match, or he says, New Guinea, dark-skinned peoples, and he's coming as light-skinned people. That's a white man's book. What are you bringing this in here for? And then he could say, no, your story starts here. That's your ancestor. And I should say, as a side note, there are a tremendous amount of indigenous histories that line up in this Y chromosome tree. They don't necessarily take you back to a specific son, but I can say, hey, you said you came from these people, or you crossed the Bering Strait, as the Delawares imply, at this particular date. We can see that echo genetically in your DNA. You're kind of fuzzy back here. You have an echo of creation, fall, flood, ice age. They don't give a lot of generation by generation detail. I say, and I can take this match between your history and the Y chromosome tree, and then take the Y chromosome tree to take it back even further to, this is where your story starts in Genesis 10. This is where you came from. And one of the things we're doing right now, we formed a Native American study group, because there have been a number of Native Americans who responded, seeing the video, say, hey, we want to find out who we came from.
Yeah.
We want to participate. One of the first things we're doing is collecting as many Indigenous accounts as we can. It was in this process.
Well, I tell you, when I was reading that section, I have, to my knowledge, I have no Native ancestry. But even that got me thinking, man, I wish I had the time to dig into some of these different people groups and learn their history, because it's really engaging.
It was just a couple weeks ago, I think, I was going through this book on the Incas, as we're trying to collect as a group these accounts. And so this is just a mainstream source kind of for graduate students if they're going into Peruvian or whatever archaeology, South American archaeology. And they had a section in here, this is how the discovery came about, where I want to read here it is, the title, Incan Myths of Origin and Expansion. So that's the general academic attitude.
Yeah.
Which is sad that they mostly view indigenous accounts as they're all wrong unless we can find some archaeology to confirm it. And so they say there's this...
Well, at least they're treating them the same way they treat the biblical archaeologists.
It is consistent. So they say, here's their traditional Incan king list, 13 kings. And they say, well, archaeology kind of talks about some of these later guys right close to the Spanish arrival. But that other stuff is, we don't have to do with it. Fortunately, they reference the source, and I think I have it right here. Yeah, it's by a Spaniard. The translation here, I think, is 1907 into English. Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, History of the Incas. And so then I, let me look it up, see what they say. I didn't know. And this was remarkable on a number of fronts. This isn't the book, because it was just the last few weeks. And I was surprised for being... So this is, I think, late 1500s, when he's going to the Incas and asking them, what is your history? Which is where they say there's the 13 kings that is myth, that we don't treat as serious. This guy goes and talks to, I think, 100 different Incas. What's your history? Tell me. He reads aloud what he finds to the community. Speak now, forever hold your peace. If I've gotten something wrong, speak up so I can correct it. Which I feel that's a fairly rigorous scientific way to do it. Let me collect it all. You can publicly criticize it. Yeah, and this is 1500s guy, which I thought that's remarkable for that era. And then he goes through that's where the 13 rulers come from. And so I was reading through the initial section one evening at home, and then kind of skipped over a lot of the middle part, the good chunk of it where it talks about a lot of events during each of these 13 kings' rule, and got to the end where he summarized it and says, so the Incas, who began their rule of tyranny in the 500s AD, I thought, wait, what? Where did this come from? And he went to bed, got up the next day, went back through, did he make this up? No. Went back to the sections that kind of breezed through. It talks about this guy was this old when he became ruler and king, and he ruled for this long, and this is when he died, and it's very detailed.
And this is all originally oral history?
And he talks about that as well. He says they have an oral history, but he says it's fairly rigorous, where the fathers will basically train their sons. We're going to practice this until you know it wrote. They have, of course, the quipu system, which is that knots on a string, which I think the anthropologists still debate, should we consider this literacy or not? Were they pre-literate? Because it's not letters, it's just numbers. But he said they have that as well for helping as a memory device for the numbers, but they need to keep track of. And it's very detailed again. Are there elements that seem exaggerated?
Remarkable.
Yeah.
But oral history matches up with the genetic stuff you're finding.
Yes.
That's amazing.
It matches exactly like, and they say it begins with 4 brothers and 4 sisters. The 3 brothers eventually get knocked off, and there's elements where he became stone. I thought, I have a feeling you're kind of whitewashing. You may have killed him. If there's stuff like that, do you throw out the entire account? No. I think there's ways you can plausibly interpret this and not discard. There's detailed dates. It's not like there's some sort of mathematical pattern where we just invented stuff out of thin air. And it's not like this guy's reading his his Catholic history into it, because he begins
Sure.
with, here's what I think in the 1500s, who they came from, and he cites the Greeks, and then when he gets to this section, he calls it like the fables of the Incas. He's clearly dismissive as, now we know this isn't true type thing, but I'm going to tell you what it is anyways for sake of posterity or whatever, and here's this account that now, well, what, 16, 17, 18, 19,
This
several
500
centuries later,
500 years ago.
we can get the DNA from these people and say, so it's not just that the timing of their arrival in Peru matches, because from the DNA, what it implies was there's a migration across the Bering Strait, a rapid dispersal through the Americas, and eventual replacement of the indigenous peoples, which the Delawares say was 10,000 who came across. Small band, and if you're going up and down the Americas, it's going to be small, close related groups of people.
Yeah.
4 brothers, 4 sisters, fits that almost exactly. And again, is there stuff that's probably exaggerated?
They're going back to all of the Americas.
To their founding. So they'd say we Incas came from this set of 8 people, 4 brothers, 4 sisters.
Who started in Asia.
They don't talk about that. Actually, let me think here. I think there may be an element of a creation account.
Okay.
In some of these, there's gaps.
Are they going back to that Bering Strait crossing?
They don't have that, I don't think.
Whether
but they do say
recognize it as Bering Strait or just,
that's a good question.
some kind of great migration.
I don't think they have that element like the Delawares do.
Okay.
They do have, though, we began here in Peru or Cusco or whatever else
Okay.
with this guy, and he was this old, and so that's where the clock, in a sense, starts.
That's where it starts, okay.
But you bring up a good point. What do you do about the gaps? And all these accounts of gaps, the Maya...
I just would have been really impressed if they went back that far.
Yes. And
this isn't impressive.
Yeah.
But
one of the things we're trying to work through then is how do you synthesize all these accounts? Because some are very short, like the Mayan account, the Popol Vuh, it's a P-O-L, one word, and then V-U-H, second word.
Okay.
Where they have a section that sounds a lot like Genesis 1. There was the gods, they have plural gods, I think, that create the world, the universe, and it was dark. And there's a lot of, man, it makes you think of Genesis 1 type thing. Then there's a section that I don't know what to do with that's about the gods fighting and these 2 brothers, and one gets decapitated and the gods play soccer or whatever, or some sort of game with his head, and it's strange. I don't know what to do with it. And then they get to a section where they talk about Toyon or Tula, which I've known about for quite some time, because the Aztecs say we came from the same place of reeds. And no one really has had an answer to what this is. It's an island, they say. Well, Popol Vuh says we came from this place in the east, across the sea, and they say, and we were all of one language.
Oh.
And we were these 7 tribes, or whatever it was. I'm like, this sounds like Babel. I think we finally solved it. And then it talks about the arrival of the first guy, I think, but then it jumps immediately into just a few centuries right before the Spanish arrival. So then I was taken aback. Well, what do you do with this? I think what's going on, and I think this is a principle that generally applies. My guess is there's a lot of information in what's explicitly said, and I think we can infer from between the lines in a sense, or what's not said. And what I mean is, if much of these cultures were oral, or even if they were written, we know from the Aztecs, I think, when they came in, they basically destroyed the histories of the people prior to them. And this is not anything new. The Chinese did it when the first accounts of the Qin dynasty in the 200s BC destroys the accounts of those before. You see it in the Americas today, trying to rewrite history. It's just a common practice of the conquerors who come in, and you can get rid of all that. We are the guys in charge. This is our history. The Aztecs saying we're part of this great dynasty, and that's why we're legitimate. People do this all the time. Human nature. But when a people gets disrupted, I think you can make the case they either lose it. So one of the questions we're trying to pursue now was there as great a population collapse in North America or north of the Rio Grande as we have evidence for in Central America and South America?
Oh, okay.
Even the mainstream sources that say, there were 26 million people in Central America, 24 million in South America, close to 50 to 60 million total in the Americas right before Europeans arrived, which is close to the total population of Europe. So lots of people here, and about 90% of them disappear. Those same sources still only put about 4 million north of the Rio Grande. It's this pretty stark difference. We can talk about why that may be the case, but one of the ways we can try to explore this is with DNA, because there's a smoking gun you can see in DNA of a population collapse. One of the questions we want to answer. And anyway, if that actually happened, I'm thinking to myself, well, what if you're part of North America? Because we have Iroquois accounts of origins. The Navajos have an account. I've got a book right here from the Hopis. Anyway, if you're living here, and let's say it's the elders who've been entrusted with preserving your nation's history, and then they get wiped out because this disease runs rampant, smallpox or whatever else, and it's the younger generation who either wasn't entrusted with it or they haven't gone through all their lessons, or there's just massive chaos because the people are dropping dead next to you left and right and you're fleeing to try to get away from it.
Yeah.
Preserving your history isn't necessarily the highest priority, I'm going to guess. You just want to stay alive.
Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me at all if you lose chunks. And then once you get reestablished, okay, there's stability. Let's keep track of our history again. So my guess is the Popol Vuh, for whatever reason, I think preserves perhaps some of this distant Genesis memory. I don't know if Toyon is Babel or not, but there's strong hints that maybe it is. Then there's some sort of disruption, and then it restarts again in the Yucatan Peninsula in maybe the 1300s. Anyway,
we're still kind of foggy as to the nature of the dispersal at Babel. Like we don't know exactly who went where and how. And
I'd say we have a good start biblically, where about half the names in Genesis 10, we've got a sense for where they went. About half the names we have, these become candidates for large chunks of the globe, different regions of the globe. In combination with DNA, we can begin to trace this history.
Yeah.
Something really interesting has arisen since the book that colors this ancient history. And maybe go back and pay more close attention to the early chapters of Genesis, post-Genesis 11. In the book, I talk about one particular branch that's found heavily in South India called Haplogroup H, branch H.
Okay.
And I speculate that maybe this is the original Indians, perhaps the Dravidian peoples or the peoples of the Indus Valley civilization, one of the cradles of civilization. I've begun to rethink that. And the reason is, and I don't have enough data to publish this per se, you can find an ancient branch of H in Europe. In fact, there is a branch in the book, in one of the diagrams, there's a French individual who's part of this H, which I thought, that's just part of the South Asian diaspora now. And just to give an example of the diaspora, one of the major studies of the Y-chromosome called the 1,000 Genomes Project, they published a paper in 2016 on 1,200 men from around the globe. They had 5 South Asian populations, 2 Indian populations. One was Gujaratis, and the other was Telugus. The Gujaratis, they sampled from Houston, Texas.
Okay.
There's an Indian community there. And there's a bunch who showed up in haplogroup H, as they might in India. And then there were the Telugus, who were living in the UK. So they didn't even go to India to sample the people. There's been enough Indians who've dispersed throughout the globe, they just went there.
Yeah.
So that's in the back of my head.
Over a million of them.
Yeah, so I'm thinking a French individual, probably because they married into some Indian family, who knows.
Sure.
Now I'm thinking, because there's been others who've come, either people who've come forward who are of European descent belong to that, or there's enough that's popped up in reading or exploring other data sets. I'm like, I think there is this group that has this ancient branch around the time of Abraham, so that this rare European branch separates from a generally populous Indian branch. 25% or so of modern India belongs to this H. About the time of Abraham, what event in history could explain this ancient link between Europe and then India? I'm looking at the map this way, sorry, I guess I have to reorient it. And my guess is the Indo-European peoples, who are thought to have been near the north of the Black Sea.
Okay.
And I talk about them in the book, saying a separate branch, I and J, look like the Indo-Europeans. They also separate around the time of Abraham. I becomes a strong European lineage. J becomes a strong Iranian, Middle Eastern lineage. Anyway, looking back, I can even see shortcomings in what I was saying, because I should back up a second. Indo-European is a category for a bunch of different languages that are thought to be related. And as a general rule, I'd say, to a first approximation, the level of classification we call family for languages is probably a good rule of thumb for what left Babel. So English didn't leave Babel, and French, those are all part of this larger family called Indo-European. Indo, because Sanskrit is part of the same link, and I was skeptical of that.
That's what I thought was interesting, seeing that link between Europe all the way to India.
Yeah. And I found it hard to believe until I saw some of the early Sanskrit words and early European words. I'm like, those are very similar. I guess it is. I wouldn't have guessed that, but there's some pretty strong links between Europe, ancient India, as if they came from one people, and it's traced, I think, linguistically, perhaps roughly north of the Black Sea or Ural Mountains area, somewhere sort of halfway between those two places, and then they separate. and give rise to the Romans and the Greeks and the Indo-European Aryan invasion into India and such. So in the book, I have this other branch that I called Indo-European, and then I said H is this, because all I thought was that it was Indian or South Asian, which I called something else. Well, now we have this link, apparently, to ancient Europe. Long story short, H on the family tree comes from Ham. I and J come from Japheth.
Okay. And
So
I
they have-
remember, okay, Japheth seemed to have the smallest footprint in today's
He had the smallest number of
descendants.
ancient branches.
Okay.
In terms of percentage of people today, he's still got a huge chunk. So a third of Europe is I, part of that Japhetic branch. A huge chunk of the Arabian Peninsula is J1, part of that same Japhetic branch. J2 is all throughout here. So percentage of the globe is still a good chunk. It's not the majority of Europe because of this recent Central Asian migration, and I guess these guys just had more sons. I think analogous to what's going on right now in Europe, where you've got a bunch of Middle Eastern, not Central Asian, but Middle Eastern refugees who come in. They're mostly Muslim. Muslims have large families. Indigenous Europeans are mostly secular. They don't get married. They may not have kids. And even secular demographers are saying if this pattern continues, even without any more influx of refugees, simple fact that they're having more kids, bigger families, there's a multiplicative discrepancy. So multiplied over a few generations, you're going to see a huge shift demographic in Europe, where Europe might become an extension of the Middle East demographically, based on ancestry, simply because the Europeans aren't having hardly any kids. So I think that's something similar that happened just a few centuries ago, except in this case, the origin point was Central Asia came in. I think what probably happened was the Ottomans were
that was
ransacking the
real interesting.
Balkans.
Going back to the R1A and finding out my own ancestry comes from Central Asia, not only Central Asia, but recent Central Asia.
Yeah.
As far as I am concerned, 12 to 1600.
Yeah.
My Y-chromosome line comes from Norway, so that was a bit of a shock to find out that my family would go back from such a geographically distant part of the world.
Yes, and so one of the opening chapters in the book to try to set people up for this, because I look at you look at me, and both have Y chromosomes into Central Asia, and we think we don't look Chinese. In some cases, I'd say you can still kind of see the genetic echoes of this. I think of Melania Trump is from Yugoslavia, and you look at her face, the shape of her eyes. Even my wife is kind of, because I've talked about this constantly, this sort of phenomena, guessing where people are from based on their faces, facial features. High cheekbones, the shape of her eyes. She kind of looks like a tall Chinese person, light-skinned Chinese person. She does have these very Asian features. And sort of the more you go into Eastern Europe, which is where the Mongols were in the 1200s, you see this sort of morphing into or trend towards.
Do you think this was Mongol, or would this have been Turkish, or what was?
My guess is it's still connected to the Ottoman Turks. One of the challenges with the R1A is, so the map I show in the book where you got, I think, 60% of the Ukrainians who belong to R1A. There's a heavy concentration in Eastern Europe, spills over some into Western Europe. Western Europe, though, is dominated by the R1B. So Jeanson is a French last name. Genetically, I'm part of that French sub-branch of R1B. S116 is what I talk about in the book. And 50 to 70% of Frenchmen belong to this R1B, Western Europe. Anyway, you see that all throughout Europe. It's the dominant lineage. This Japhetic one is now the minority. Again, I think simply due to differential reproduction, not necessarily political conquest. Muslims today in Europe are not politically conquering. They're just having more kids. So the timing of the dispersion seems a little bit late for the Mongols. I don't yet know if R1A was resident in Europe and then the Mongols pushed them and kind of sent them fleeing. I think that's what happened with R1B. Just the sub-branches look like the Mongols pushed into Hungary about that time, and so whoever was there
just kept going.
Where they're laying waste to the Hungarian plain. Let's get out of here. And they disperse in a geographically predictable pattern around, past Vienna, where there's the Carpathian Mountains are around the Hungarian plain. And so how do you escape? Not over the mountains, but through the pass, past Vienna, and then into the Central European plain, down into France, Spain, and so forth, across the English Channel into the UK and British Isles and Ireland. R1A kind of almost as the mirror image the other direction, and ends up down even into Central Asia and India. What I don't know about R1A, what we do know for R1b is R1b has a bunch of earlier branches that we can kind of map out and see it, in a sense, literally walking into Europe from Central Asia. The early branches are there, later branches in Eastern Europe, latest branches in Western Europe. You can see this progression with time.
Cool.
We don't have that same sort of data, for whatever reason, for R1a. Almost all the branches just rapidly disperse and separate just a few centuries ago. And then it's this long, flat line going back into the past. Why is that? In the book, I don't really answer it because I didn't really know. Long story short, which probably even a longer technical discussion, how I've begun to sort of rethink or better make sense of deep separation points. And maybe back up and just make a technical point briefly. Family trees inherently record not just who you come from or the time of when you came from someone. They also record changes in population size. It's kind of a kindergarten point, but technical at the same time. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So, for my family tree, it's me, and then I've got 3 boys.
Yep.
So there's population growth, 3 branches, but that's true around the globe. And so if you have a representative sample of people around the globe, you can look at how fast or slow their branches come together and get a sense for how big or small the population was, or how the population rose and fell. And you can also, so there's ancestry, time, population growth, and migrations. That's where it gets a little bit more technical, where normally if you have an intermixing population, if it's a stable size, again, this is statistics and math, you tend to lose lineages over time. If that population separates for whatever reason, maybe someone comes in and, let's just flee, or they fight and they flee, whatever it is, and they stay their same constant population sizes. Normally, again, you'd lose some of these ancient lineages just due to statistical math considerations.
Sure.
But because they separated and they both continued to exist and survived, you've got a permanent record then genetically of where these branches went their separate ways. So all that to say, when I began to think through all these considerations and the math of, given how many people we sampled, how far back can we go in history in terms of population size, and so if we see a branch back here, is it population size or is it migration or both? Long story short, the fact that we have R1a separating from R1b, I think around the time of Christ, if not sooner, my guess is that was probably a migration event, number one. Again, I'm hopping over a bunch of technical detail just for sake of time and simplicity.
Oh, I'm over time, but I'm not going to stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's probably an ancient migration event. And then what happened? So they went their separate ways, maybe around the time of Christ. Then what's next? Maybe this is where the population growth comes in. And again, this is all just a model that we can test. Mm-hmm. Long flat line seems to imply, perhaps, no subsequent migrations, and or a place where there was a constant population size. Or if you were to draw the population growth curve of the survivors, it was flat. Mm-hmm. The Middle East is well known to have about a millennium of just flat growth. It does this, but the people who survive the ups and the downs, because again, the Mideast has been a hotbed of conflict for millennia. There's just people constantly going through because there's no geographic barriers to invasion. Mm-hmm. Alexander comes in, then the Persian comes in, then the Turks come in, and it's just on and on it goes. And the Black Death comes through. Even after the initial Mongol conquest, you have Tamerlane coming through from Central Asia and laying waste, I think, slaughtering 80,000 people in Baghdad. It's a tumultuous place. And so you have population growths and rise and up and down. And so when all is said and done, it effectively becomes flat.
It averages out to flat.
It just becomes flat because whatever that last dip is, it wipes out enough of the previous growth where it's basically flat for 1,000, 1,400 years.
Wow.
And that's kind of how the R1a branch looks. From about the time of Christ, just flat until about the 12 to 1600s. And then it starts rapidly growing when the whole world starts growing again. Which makes me wonder, was R1a in the Middle East for a long period, and then somehow gets caught up in the Ottomans, because they're one of the last people, the Turks are one of the last people to kind of come through here. It's the Seljuk Turks in the 1000 AD, who then are followed by the Mongols, who almost kick them out of the modern Turkey. They survive, they're on the tip, and about the 1300s, I think, is when the Ottomans revive, in a sense, and then start expanding back into the Middle East, one direction, into the Balkans, the European direction. Okay. And so I wonder if R1a is kind of part of that Ottoman activity, and either part of the Ottomans or somehow is in that area when the Ottomans go conquering, and so then disperse as a result of that. I don't know yet. Okay. And what I would love to see, and I think it may be out there if we sample enough people, there may be some more of these ancient branches or pre-1200s AD branches that will tell us, okay, yeah, if we sample enough Iranians or whatever else, if we sample enough Europeans, wherever, my guess is we'll eventually find some more of these older branches, and then the question will be, well, where do we find them? Can we map out, do we see a migration path for R1A like we do for R1B? That'll help answer the question. But I'm beginning to wonder if it was indeed a migration into the Middle East about the time of Christ, if not, or the centuries surrounding him. Residence in the Middle East for that long period of time, because that's the smoking gun in a sense of being there. It's one of the few places where it's just flat because it's wild politically. And then late in history does this dispersion. So R1A, R1B are linked, also linked to R2 and Q, and all those have a Central Asian origin ultimately. But there may be a very complicated story that takes it from Central Asia, perhaps through the Middle East, eventually to Europe, where... So here's one of the things, too, that I was rather shocked to learn.
Maybe I missed something there, but my understanding was that this goes back to about the 1200s, and you're pushing it back to the time of Christ.
Oh, I should clarify then. The R1A branch, so if this is time of Christ, it's basically one long flat line about the 12 to 1600s, and then it separates.
Okay, that's when it goes into Europe and elsewhere. Okay.
That's when you see a European section of the tree, a Central Asian section of the tree, a South Asian section of the tree, and you can find it at decent levels all those different places. I think it got into India via Central Asia. The Mughal Empire was one of the last ones in India before British arrived. And the Mughals were they were Mongols. Mughal is the Persian word, I think, for Mongol. They came from the north into India, which is where I think that's hotbed for sort of Central Asian activity. And I'm saying, but if you say, okay, where was R1A before that rapid dispersion?
Sure.
Trace it back further. That's where I'm trying to.
So I go into Central Asia and then go further back into the Middle East.
Oh, let me clarify this. So I know in the 12 to 1600s there's this rapid dispersal, probably perhaps somewhere in Europe and then going outwards.
Okay.
And then if you go back to the time of Christ, R1A links to R1B. And those, I think, were in Central Asia.
Okay.
The question is what happens between those two time points, where you just have this long, flat line that I've kind of been scratching my head about for a while, just because there's no data. So what do you do? And then to realize, no, there is data, I think, if you know how to interpret it. Long, flat line could be a marker of just flat population growth. And there's sections of the globe that have it or don't have it. So Europe kind of does this, and it does not have a flat line. There's more preserved activity,
I guess. They don't have the war history quite as much as the Middle East. It's more plagues and...
Maybe what I could say is if the Black Death was more lethal.
Okay.
In Europe, it's thought of it killed off only
a third,
33% of the people.
Yeah.
So Europe, has this population growth, and then instead of dipping way down, which would then give you a flat line because you erase all that previous history because you kill off so many of those people effectively because their descendants are gone. It doesn't dip as far, so you still have that echo. Whereas the Middle East has enough of the final dip that it just erases all that. And effectively, the smoking gun of being in the Middle East is this long, flat line, whereas Europe, it's not a flat line. It's more nuanced. East Asia is more nuanced. Sub-Saharan Africa is more nuanced. And on it goes. So that's where I began to think, how do we connect? Yes, I know in the time of Christ, it was connected to R1b, which was Central Asia. And then in the last few centuries, it did this rapid dispersal through Eastern Europe and Central Asia and India. But what about between those two time points? That's what I'm still trying to figure out. I'm suspicious perhaps it was in the Middle East, but my hope is future research, testable predictions, will uncover more of that detail, give us some more branches. They're obviously rare if they still exist, but my hope is there's enough of them still preserved where you can begin to map out and say, aha, well, these branches we find only in Iran, or these branches we only find in the Caucasus Mountain region, or in modern Iraq, or wherever. That's what I'm hoping we'll be able to do.
Cool. Well, I've gone way over your time. So,
fun thing to talk about for me, though. So
like I said, I came in here saying I was excited to talk, and I'm not going to stop you because I find it fascinating too. So where can people find the book and more information on this, or help you with your research?
Yes. So the book, which again to me is the beginning of something that I hope I can work on for the rest of my life, and even then we probably won't solve all the answers. But it's fun to chase them. And again thinking about the fact that the Bible kind of sets up shooting fish in a barrel.
Yeah.
Maybe we can solve a lot of these questions where make history boring again. Instead of being this mystery trying to solve, now it's a bunch of dates and people have to memorize, who cares?
Yeah.
Right now, it's kind of fun in a sense, not tongue-in-cheek boring. It's important. It just, I think many school kids probably like myself, memorization of dates and times isn't that interesting. But chasing mysteries and solving them is kind of exciting. So we're in the solving the mystery stage.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of them to do. But you can get this through Answers in Genesis, our web store. If you call into customer service, you can get it on the publisher. Publisher is Master Books.
Yep.
So masterbooks.com or .org. Amazon, many of these places sell it. You can get it in this hardcover form, which you're going to have all the charts in the middle. We sort of picked the lesser of two evils here. Instead of putting it throughout the text, we're trying to balance. Many need to be in color, and many are referenced in separate chapters. So do we have the reader flipping back through a bunch of different pages, or just keep your finger here in the middle? We thought that might be the easiest. The lesser of the evils. There's an ebook form where if you get the Kindle version, you can actually hot link. If you bought it several months ago, they didn't have it up to speed then. Now, if you just update it or whatever, if you bought it previously, if you buy it fresh now on Kindle, you can be reading the text and you just click the link, it'll take you right to it, and you can click right back to it. Okay. I don't think the PDF is quite the same. Again, part of the challenge is this.
Yeah, I was a little confused with the version your publicist sent to me. Okay. She sent me a PDF, watermarked, and whatnot. And I was probably halfway through I was not quite halfway through the book. I was maybe a couple chapters before the color plates, before I realized, I actually have the color plates. I thought that my version just didn't have the color plates.
Yes.
So. And then what I did was I had on my iPad, I had the PDF that I was reading, and then I put the book up on my computer. So I put the color plates up, roughly where I was in the book, so that as I'm reading, I could just scroll to the next page or a couple pages and find that color plate stuff. But I ended up with two screens going for a while.
Yes, and you can even see in some of the Amazon reviews, some of the earlier ebook purchaser, the color plates aren't there, and even had people messaging me on Facebook or social media saying, where are the color plates? Well, sorry, it's after chapter 12, I think, or 11, whatever it is.
I must have been about 9 before I figured it out.
Okay, yes, and my apologies. Yeah. And even when I was reviewing the markup, or before it went to press, I'd print it all off on paper, yank out the color plate section, put it here as I'm reading through it. Kind of have these two stacks.
Yeah, I thought it was just because I got a review copy that the publicist sent me. It wasn't a purchased copy, so I thought maybe it got left out. But
we also have now. They did this in April. I think it was released maybe about May. An audio version, so a professional reader read through the text. It's an enhanced audio version. I think it's like $16 because you get him reading it, plus you get, because again, the color plates are such a critical part of it, I think a PDF download so that you can be listening to it and then have it in front of you. So, which obviously is not audio, but how do you read off, this circle is 60% of Ukraine, and a picture really is worth 1,000 words in this case. So they can get that way, and if people want to participate in future research, or they get a result like we discussed here, oftentimes 23andMe won't give you, this is R1A, they'll give you R dash.
Yeah, what did I get? I got R
inscrutable marker.
CTS 4179, which I had to go into Google and find a couple other sources that said, you're R1A.
Yeah. And so what probably half the people who've written in have said is, I got my result, what does it mean? And I can look it up in a table in 10 seconds and say, this is what it means, and here's a brief snippet of your email, which is a lot of fun for me too. But so if you have a question about it, if you want to participate in future research, any of these sorts of things related to the book, if you go to answersingenesis.org, that's the homepage, /go/traced, TRACED, title of the book, it'll take you to a section where you just can scroll down on that page, and you'll have name, first name, last name, phone, email, and then message, and that just goes straight to my inbox.
Cool.
And correspond with people that way. Been a lot of fun.
And I'll put that in the show notes too. So echozoe.com/173. It's episode 173.
Okay.
So cool.
And I look forward to anyone who wants to correspond that way or participate in future research. Like I said, there's been people around the globe. We've done these videos too, I think, which is one of the main ways we've gotten the word out globally. Learned there was an island called Puka Puka in the Pacific, because there's a guy from Puka Puka who said, hey, what's the story of our people? We want to know. And we went and looked that up, and Philippines, and we're forming study groups too as concentrations of people
Cool.
And say if we want to find it out. So East Asian study or Southeast Asian study group. We've got enough Pacific Islanders. I've got a couple Hawaiians who've contacted me, and I don't talk about Hawaii in the book because there wasn't published data. So there's really intriguing questions we can begin to answer now. And does this line up with archaeology when it was settled? And were there multiple trips between these islands, between Hawaii and some of the French Polynesia and Easter Island and New Zealand and such before Europeans arrived? Because these people were remarkable sailors with pre-modern technology, get from Samoa up to Hawaii. And
that was something I thought was interesting. Was you talked a little bit about Easter Island, and just geographically, I looked up Easter Island, and you got latitude and longitude.
Yeah,
the longitude was right on par with about where the Navajo were.
Yeah.
Like the Four Corners, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. They made it quite far east.
Yes. And they're not building these, Francis Drake style ships.
No.
They've got their Polynesian crafts, which are great seaworthy crafts, and they're navigating by the star, tremendous navigators, not with the so-called modern instruments.
Yeah.
So
Sextant.
Yeah. Which, again, if you think they made it that far, why wouldn't they kind of, I'm going to go take a week-long cruise and visit my relatives in Samoa or whatever else. I don't know. Yeah. Genetically, we might be able to find this, so this is what we're exploring.
Cool. Well, I'd love to contact you again and maybe in a year and see what you're up to.
We'll be glad to.
Fascinating for me, but thanks so much, and really enjoyed it.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Echo Zoe Radio is an outreach of Echo Zoe Ministries. If you are blessed by the show, please consider offering your support. There are many things you can do to help, including prayer, sharing the show with others, and your financial support. Echo Zoe Ministries is a registered nonprofit organization with 501c3 tax-exempt status, and your donations are tax-deductible. For more information about how you can support Echo Zoe Ministries, please visit echozoe.com/support.
That wraps up episode 173. Thanks for listening to Echo Zoe Radio. For show notes, visit echozoe.com/173. Come join Echo Zoe Ministries on Locals at echozoe.locals.com, and you can support the ministry there, as well as interact with the community and watch the film Jerusalem's King. And I look forward to seeing you there. As you heard, I would love to have Dr. Jeanson back on to talk about his latest research sometime next year. If you have any questions you'd like me to ask him, assuming we're able to do another episode, please reach out to me via social media, Locals, or echozoe.com/contact, and I would be happy to add it to a future follow-up discussion. Lord willing, we'll be back next month with the October episode of Echo Zoe Radio.